Hey guys, this is John and I'm playing zopenco61 in a 5+5 game on chess.com. It's another climbing the rating ladder. My opponent opens with b3. Okay. Larsen's favorite opening, or at least the opening his name is attached to. I like to play d5 against this one, so e5 is another way to play. The main line, in fact, but in my mind it doesn't make so much sense to put that pawn on an attack square. So I'm going to play my bishop out to g4. Unusual move, but I've found that this line disrupts the normal way white likes to develop, which white will often play e3 and then try to get the light square bishop out. Yeah, and they can play knight f3, but I really like taking and doubling up white's pawns. I think this gives white some unique problems to solve in this opening. All right, so e takes f3. Yep, this is the correct recapture. Let's play e6 now. And I'm looking to play knight f6. And I often try to fianchetto my dark square bishop to oppose this bishop here. And it makes sense to begin arranging pawns on light squares because I just traded my light square bishop for white's knight. So if I can shore up the light squares in this fashion, good to do so. Okay, so nice to get a game against the Nimzo-Larsen. f4, very early f4 for my opponent. I think I can just proceed as planned, knight f6. Yeah, don't think I have to worry about an f5 break yet. If white were to play something like queen e2, then maybe I would consider the ramifications of f5, also queen b5 check. But okay, white plays g3, looks like white's going for a fianchetto. I'm going to do the same. My knight is defended by my queen here, so I'm temporarily looking a little exposed on that diagonal, but once the bishop comes to g7, everything's fine. And I think we're very likely going to have bishop g2, bishop g7, castle, castle. I'm just going to castle short. I don't think postponing castling makes any sense here. And now as far as how I develop the queen side, I may go c6 and knight d7. I may also play for c5 and put the knight on c6. I can think about that expansion. I've played some games in this line where white plays d4, but I've also seen plenty of players playing white who prefer d3 and knight d2, so I'll be curious which way Zopenco goes, or if they do that at all. I think d3, knight d2, knight f3, and then trying to install the knight on e5 is the most thematic thing to do. So all normal so far. I mean, I think Zopenco is using a little bit more time than they probably should on natural moves, but okay, d3. Yeah, and now do I want to go for c5 or knight c6? That's kind of a key question. I think I'm going to go for c5 and take a bit more space. But yeah, it could also be solid c6, put pawns on this diagonal to block the bishop. You know, interestingly, in the opening, I was talking about how after b3, e5, I wasn't a big fan of that move because white can attack it. But I do have to say it does make sense on a strategic level because you would be trying to block that dark square bishop. I just think the mechanics of it, the dynamics of it, are not necessarily in black's favor there. Knight f3, okay. So heading for that square most likely. I could try to play knight e8 now and look to swap the dark square bishops. But I think I'm just going to play rook c8. I feel like this move is extremely handy going forward. Maybe prepares a c4 pawn break in the future. Definitely looking to play probably mostly on the queen side coming up. Now, if white plays knight e5, I may go knight d7, looking to force some sort of resolution there. Rook b1, okay. So I think the only reason white would play rook b1 is so that this bishop is defended. That's a very interesting move. It leaves the a2 pawn weak, so my eye is immediately drawn towards queen a5, attacking that pawn. Just to see if white plays a3. Maybe if white plays a3, I have more license to move my knight away, or even to e8. So, yeah, queen a5 looks like kind of a good probing move here. Connects my rooks, so I'm going to play it. So players at this rating level tend to be fairly solid, you know, at least tactically. They don't drop pieces flagrantly. A player like me definitely has to work to beat someone at this rating level. But they're not immune from making strategic mistakes and experiencing the whole catalog of errors that really everyone does, even at higher levels. But tactically, they tend to be more solid than what you would see 200 points lower, let's say. Okay, a3. Their mistakes, if they're going to make them on a tactical level, tend to be more more subtle. So yeah, a3, and now I was mentioning moving that knight. So where do I want to move the knight if I'm going to move it? I mean, in the past I've done this because I like swapping on g7 so the knight can come to f5. But given that white might answer that with knight e5, I'm kind of leaning towards knight d7. And I'm going to play that move. And I'm okay with the trade, then I'll be threatening queen takes a3. So I'll pre-move that. So yeah, here white can't really meet this move with knight e5. We do get a swap. We're even on the clock. Yeah, I spent probably a little too long on knight d7, 45 seconds. Could have made that faster. Okay, an a4. So now these dark squares look a little bit weak, like the c3 square. I'm thinking about moves like knight d4 even. Knight d4 jumping in, or queen c3 first. But maybe knight d4. I think that could produce a favorable structure. Yeah, let's play it. So I'm actually accepting double pawns if white wants to take, but then that c2 pawn will be the target. So I like the look of this. Maybe queen c3 next, attack c2. b4 is a deflection move I considered briefly before playing this, but it won't work. If c takes b4, I would drop the knight. That's the point of it, but I can insert an in-between move. Knight takes f3 check, white takes back, and then c takes b4. I guess I could even play queen takes a4 perhaps, but yeah, suffice it to say, b4 shouldn't be working for white. So trying to force a favorable trade here. Maybe white goes knight e5, but I think I would actually be okay with that trade, even though it does straighten out white's pawns, because I have that queen c3 move coming up, which I think is going to keep white under a great deal of pressure. And then maybe gradually I can open the queen side, a6, b5. Plan like that. Okay, and my opponent's definitely considering this move pretty closely, so he seems to have a pretty good sense of danger. Understands that he might be coming under some pressure here, trying to figure out the best way forward. Rook e1, okay. So rook e1 doesn't seem to change a whole lot. I can still play queen c3. I don't really want to initiate this trade. I'd rather play queen c3 and again see if white will take. Maybe white will take on d4, I take with the pawn, and they'll play rook e2. But long term, I still really like that situation. So I think I'm going to play this. Just seems like the most logical follow-up to my knight d4 idea. And you can see that rook c8 move that I played back on move 11. Starting to prove handy, even though I haven't broke with c4. There's this idea always in the air, opening the c-file if I take with the pawn. So even here, if white plays knight takes d4, definitely taking with the pawn. Because doubled pawns yield open files. That's maybe one mini takeaway already from this. Structurally, yes, they are going to be weaknesses sometimes. You know, in the value of the pawns, they're discounted because they're doubled up. But they do yield open files. So if the open files are very helpful, that may override the fact that the pawns are doubled. Okay, now I think the time situation is becoming a big problem for white. There is that 5-second increment, but I'm going to look to play aggressive, keep the pressure on. I mean, white could consider rook c1 and knight takes d4. I think that's basically, yeah, the only options. Now, how do I continue applying pressure? Maybe a6, b5, with an eye towards opening the queen side, playing rook a8, rook a2. I don't see a great way to further attack this at the moment. Don't think going for c4 makes any sense yet. This rook is not engaged yet, but I don't think I have to. I don't see any tactics involving knight e2 or queen takes e1 business. So yeah, let's play a6, go for b5. Queen's not in danger of being trapped. It's even hard for white to trade it now because queen d2, I can play knight takes f3 check, remove the guard. So this seems like a good, simple way of making progress here. Knight e5, take that. And white does take with the pawn, okay. But yeah, now these pieces just seem very strong. f6 is a little bit weak for me, but hard for white to get their queen in there. I think I'm going to go ahead and play b5. Again, just scanning real quick, seeing if there's anything more tempting, c4 type stuff, but no, I like this. And the plan is trade, rook a8, rook a2, get a third attacker on c2 when it may be difficult for white to defend. Note that my knight controls the e2 square. And I think in the future, white has to watch out for tactics involving queen takes e1 or a knight e2 move. Not working at the moment, but I could envision some scenarios where it may work out. Okay, f4. I don't see how that interferes with my plan at all, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. f5 is very well guarded, so I'm not worried about this pawn break. I have it defended 3 times. g4, f5 I think is going to be too slow. White may go for this at this point because their position looks pretty desperate otherwise, and so does the clock situation. I wouldn't be surprised to see g4, f5. Yep. And now I can continue rook a2, or I can play f6. f6 might be an interesting way to just remind white that I can also play down the f file. That seems kind of like a good move to me. Yeah, and it might be unexpected, especially in white's time pressure. Because rook a2, they'll probably play f5, and I can take on c2, but the battle is going to gravitate towards the other wing. So I think I like f6. And since I can play it quickly, I'm going to do it. My knight guards e6, so even though I'm slightly weakening that pawn, I think this is going to work out well. White's queen really has a hard time joining the action here. f5, okay. Interesting way to try to weaken my structure. That's probably a good attempt. I think I can play g takes f5 though. I'm going to do that. And assuming g takes f5, I can take with the knight. Pivot that knight back. There's a check on g4, but I think it actually helps me because I can play king g8. Yeah, and if pawn takes here, I have a nice choice between queen takes or rook takes f6. Probably take with the rook. Keep e6 defended. Yeah, check, but this should be helpful for me. I get to secure my king. Now rook g8 could be a problem in the future. All right, so e6 is loose. Candidates here, rook g8. Also, either capture on f6, I think is looking strong. Probably going to take with a rook on f6. Checking to see if there's any loose pieces. Like, I do undefend my rook here, but it's so far away from the action, I don't think white can hurt me. Yeah, white has no time left. Yeah, and white flags. Okay. So it would have been interesting to see the conclusion of that one, but I think this position should be winning for black. I'm up a pawn. I have rook g8 on the way. Possible doubling ideas. Just a litany of things that white has to worry about here. My queen coming in, still very active. White has a rook that's tied down to the defense of c2. So I've mentioned this before in a Climbing the Rating Ladder I played maybe a month ago, but it's super important to come out of the opening with a plan or some sort of major way forward, because I feel like white lacked a plan in this one, and they were just beginning to react to my threats, especially right around here. And I think maybe the genesis of this was this rook b1 move on move 12. I think that move was unnecessary. It looks overly cautious, but at the same time weakening, since it took white's eye off the a2 pawn. I think white would be better off continuing with the knight e5 plan, or maybe playing rook e1 knight e5. And I'm a little biased in this line. I was talking about how I enjoy playing this variation for black, but I think it's harder for white to find a plan than it is for black, because white has the pair of bishops, but the position is not open at all. There haven't been any pawn trades, so even though this bishop occupies a decent diagonal, so does mine in opposition to that. I think it's kind of hard for white to do much once we get this far. But yeah, rook b1, I think, was the start of white more or less just reacting to my threats. But I will admit already at this point, I think this position's pretty tough for white, especially given the time situation. So I'm not completely sure what I would do differently if I were white here. I probably would have taken that knight on d4. Either, yeah, right here or maybe on this move. Because I think this situation take and rook e2, although extremely passive, is probably better than the one white got into in the game. Because c2 is white's only weakness, and at least this way the rook can actually help defend laterally, as opposed to that knight on d4 just hanging over white's head. I mean, I feel like a knight like that, white's going to have to address at some point, and because of the knight e5 trade, unless white were somehow able to play c3 here, white can never evict this knight without sacrificing for it. It's even difficult to sacrifice for it. White can't even easily sack an exchange for it. So, yeah, I think knight e5 especially got white into trouble, but really dislike that rook b1 move from the beginning. You know, and for this matter, maybe white's better off playing this d4 plan, trying to clamp e5 even more. Maybe white's hesitant to block this bishop. I know it's not in the spirit of the Nimzo-Larsen, but it's possible. It's a possible idea. So, yeah, I think a couple potential improvements for white, but just kind of one of these positions that can easily cascade to a big, big disadvantage when you get into a passive situation here. But important to be a bit more proactive about fighting. Yeah, rook b1, I think too defensive. But I like how I played it. I don't have any moves that I'm really second guessing. I think playing on the other wing with f6 is kind of interesting. I'll be curious what the computer says about that, opening a second front. I especially like this move in the opponent's time pressure because it's unexpected, forces them to adjust on the fly. I'm pretty sure white was focusing on rook a2, which objectively may be the best move. I don't see a major issue with it, but I really like the idea of this too. I think f5 was an interesting way to react, by the way, because I think if white just captures here, I have very easy pressure against f4. I mean, I looked briefly at this and then swing the rook over, and white can't defend this pawn, as the queen can't help. So I think f5 at least made it kind of complicated, but I didn't mind that given the time situation. Felt like I was coming out on top here. Yeah, and had the game continued, like I said, I was going to bring this rook over, maybe double up. Probably king h1, most likely move for white, but let's say rook g8. And white has to be very careful where they put the queen, because if they put it on the f-file, queen f3 or queen f4, they're going to be asking for discoveries. Maybe queen f4 avoids the worst, but queen f3 would run into knight h4. Note that my rook is defended here. It's just a minefield of a position. I mean, maybe queen h5 is better, but I have stuff like queen d2, threatening mate. Yeah, if here, there's all sorts of tactics, like I can start considering rook takes g2, which I don't think works because of queen e8 check here. But, oh, also rook h6, knight g3, rook h6 in some order, maybe right away. So if the queen moves, knight g3 is mate. Just not a position white can hope to hold here, especially in time pressure. Okay, so let's click over to the analysis board real quick. And at b3, not a bad opening, but I think black equalizes pretty easily. I mean, that's a common situation for a flank opening. Generally in the openings, when we're talking about them from white's point of view, you kind of have the big four to get an advantage or fight for an advantage. e4, d4, definitely the top tier openings, but also the English and knight f3 on move 1. Knight f3 on move 1 can often transpose to d4 or English type positions. But yeah, those are considered to be the main tries for an advantage for white. So b3. Yeah, and like I said, I like this d5, bishop g4 idea. It's just kind of disruptive. You get to double their pawns up. It's a nice little idea. Versus e5. Again, it makes sense to a degree. Try to put a pawn blocking that bishop. Occupy some space in the center with the pawn, but I feel like that kind of plays into white's hands. However, interestingly, I did do a video. So the video where I was talking about my first win against a grandmaster ever, it was against Pavel Blatny at a tournament in 2002. I was 16 years old. I played the black side of this opening. And, you know, theoretically, it's totally fine. I just sometimes think, like, how can I cross my opponent's normal course of play in the opening without doing anything too crazy? And this is just a solid way to play that takes some players off guard. Let's just take a brief look at the opening explorer. Maybe right about here. So I think we're probably still following some games. Yeah, still following plenty of games. Stats look good for white. Yep, knight f6, g3. Okay, black usually playing knight bd7 here, but g6 also played a fair amount. What about queen e2? Because queen e2 briefly crossed my mind here. Kind of a tricky looking move. Idea of f5, and especially queen here. Wonder what the computer thinks about this. I might even give that pawn on b7 for the initiative, to be honest. It says c5 is fine, knight c6. Yeah, bishop e7. Bishop e7 invites white to do this, but this seems risky for white to go after this pawn pretty early. Knight b4 probably. Yeah, knight b4 hitting this pawn. Also rook b8 in the air. I could see how this could get bad for white, even though black has to temporarily play some ugly looking moves. I don't know if white wants to mess with this because rook b8, white has 2 pieces lined up here, and again the knight takes c2 threat, so computer thinks black's winning here. But yeah, that would have been an interesting option had white gone for queen e2. Instead g3, g6. Are we still following any games here? Because I was mentioning d3, d4. Yeah, it looks like white has played both of these moves. Maybe d4 is the slightly better way to go, because that's at least going to discourage black from playing c5. Although c5 was played in one game here. Let's see what the computer has to say about this. Yeah, c4, another move. c4 trying to apply pressure to d5. Computer gives white an edge a little bit here. I'd probably play c6 against that, seems consistent, but maybe white can establish a space advantage. But I definitely don't mind playing these structures again. Pay attention to all the pawns on light squares, because we don't have a light square bishop and white does. So yeah, maybe white has to be a little bit more aggressive with their pawns here. Some fairly pedestrian moves seem to land white in trouble, and especially this rook b1 move. Okay, we're still following the one game. White played rook e1. Then black played d4 after that. Yeah, that's an alternative way to play, trying to work the knight in here. Not sure I like that so much, because it does give away some control of e4 and c4. Also opens white's bishop. But yeah, rook e1, which I think I mentioned, probably a better idea than this rook b1. White doesn't need that protection of the bishop. And I feel like the move I came up with, queen a5, flowed really nicely. Interestingly, the computer does like d4 here. So I'll have to keep that move in mind in these structures. Block the bishop. Yeah, make way for knight d5. But queen a5, I felt pretty good about this. And the engine says just ignore the queen takes a2 threat. Knight e5. So is it a poison pawn if I go take it? Let's see. Take? Because if rook a1, then I'm playing queen takes b2, and my queen's not going to get trapped. So the engine comes up with this instead, I guess, with the idea of rook a1 now. Queen a6, rook here. And if queen b6, there's bishop here. That's a pretty difficult line to see, though, quite involved. I would think most players, when you play a move like queen a5, even some very strong players are automatically going to think, how can I defend this pawn? So a3 is understandable. Although in light of what happened, I mean, maybe even going back to back to a1 is decent. Just to avoid putting that pawn on a weak square. Okay, here, this is interesting. So when I play knight d7, white could consider b4. Again, not a move I didn't look at that at all. b4. Very interesting. So if I take, c takes, knight takes, I'm guessing there's going to be some sort of queen e1 move coming up. Yeah, trade the bishops, and now queen e1. Attacking this knight twice. Abandoning the defense of c2, but I can't successfully take c2 here without losing something. Yeah, my knight is hit twice, so knight comes back, and white can take on b7 with equal position according to the computer. Okay, so some interesting tactics possible if white were to play this a little more aggressively. But yeah, I didn't see these in the game, so I think it's understandable how white played here coming up. Sorry, didn't mean to turn off the engine there. Although my computer sounds like it's going to outer space when I turn on the engine. Computer fan. As I've said, my computer is 6 years old at this point. I got it in 2013, so time for an upgrade. 7 years old almost. Yeah, and I think this knight d4 move, the fact that doubled pawns yield open files, that might even be the title of this video, even though it didn't happen in the game because white never took. But important to consider moves like that, not dismiss them on principle because you're accepting supposedly weak pawns. And by the way, that's how you know you're making some progress in chess, is when you knowingly and with good cause begin to deviate from the established rules or maxims in chess, like avoid double pawns, keep your structure together at all times. Because there are situations where double pawns are great. There are situations where it's correct to take on triple isolated pawns if the dynamics of the position allows for it. So there's always exceptions, and if you're working on your game, you will start to notice scenarios where you can break the rules and do so successfully. And it feels good when your idea is validated. Yeah, I think this position's already kind of tough for white, as I was saying in the game. Computer thinks c4 should be played. c4, just trying to send the pawn forward. That makes sense before I can establish my queen on c3. Yep. So I think the gist of this is that unless white plays more aggressively with their queenside pawns and tries to, in some cases, tactically complicate the game, as you saw with b4 or daring me to take on a2, they probably do wind up worse. Because yes, this position, I mean, I think the main story is trying to avoid a position like this, because with the time situation, it's not good for white, and just the total lack of a plan, really. Like I freely admitted I was also not sure what I would do here. I see the computer is suggesting an interesting plan for black in this position. I went for a6 followed by b5. Computer's suggesting a plan involving routing the knight to c6, so I can maybe trade on f3 at some moment and replace it with the other knight. Interesting long-term plan there. Pretty happy with a6, though. And the engine wants white to play knight e2 and then knight b1 to kick out the queen. Again, not a move I saw. This is also revealing just how important it is to go over your games, guys. You know, I know I'm playing down in rating like this. There's a 1,000 rating point gap in this game, and I'm sure in watching this video, it looked like a complete crush. There wasn't maybe a whole lot that outwardly I could have improved, but I'm seeing a lot of stuff here, and I'm seeing a lot of counterplay that the computer is showing me. Not even really seeing it, the computer's just demonstrating it. So yeah, I mean, knight e2 to b1, I would not have considered that during the game, and I didn't. Even if I had more time, I don't think I would have considered that. So good defense to keep in mind there, because yeah, otherwise it's super hard to evict this queen. But if this happens, let's say even b5 here, knight b1, white can slowly start trying to kick me out. Maybe c3 after that. Pawn's protected here by the queen. My knight has to move. Much, much better than the game situation. But instead, knight e5 I took, and white does undouble their pawns, but my plan is already seriously in motion here. I think this position's basically lost for white. Equal material, but dominating strategic position for black. No counterplay for white. Yeah, b5 looking to open lines. If white does nothing over there, I can take and play rook here, go attack this. I mean, it's bad when the engine says your best move here is rook f1. You just can't really feasibly hope to hold a position like that. So take f4. Yep, and I went rook a8. And white did play g4. Because again, white doesn't have a whole lot to do. It's either play aggressively here and hope that they can complicate and confuse me, or allow me to play rook a2 next and win this pawn. Because I guess technically white could play this here and then rook f2. Still looks really bad though. Maybe I even just play rook a8. I could even try to double up the rooks on the second rank, or even play rook a1. You know, say white goes for this g4 move. I think rook a1 is going to be a good answer, with the idea of taking. So if white continues this assault, take and play rook a1 again. So something's got to give here, either double up on the second rank or get a rook into the first rank. Yeah, so g4, and what does the computer think about f6? It's a nice position to play, because it's tough to go wrong here as black, but I'm still curious. Rook a2 is the top move. But f6, okay, definitely drops the eval. It's still nice for black, but f6 maybe made it more complicated. And yeah, credit to zopenco61, because f5, top move according to the computer. I took here. Yep, G took, knight took. So I am winning a pawn in this transaction. Yeah, unfortunately this check doesn't really help white. I think it only hurts white when my king is forced back to his safe square. So better to play queen e2, but it's a lot of suffering. That's just an extra pawn for black. But I think the eval goes up a little bit because maybe with the gradual opening of the position, white has some hope with the bishop and potential weaknesses I'm creating in my own camp. But here, take. Yep, and I just took. Could also play rook g8 right away, but I think the simplicity of takes is nice. And this is the position white flagged, but it's, yeah, plus 2.5 in black's favor. Okay, so I wouldn't really recommend the Nimzo-Larsen for improvement purposes. I mean, occasionally you see title players playing this. Hikaru, for instance, he plays this a lot in blitz games, but I would kind of stick to the main four, the big four openings. If you're lower rated than Zopenco, I think sticking to e4, or at least having some e4 experience as white is super important. And, you know, I was somewhat criticizing my opponent for not having a plan here, but it's tough. I mean, I feel like I played a lot of natural moves, and so did white, and white landed in a tough position, but I'd say especially try to avoid moves like rook b1. It's not a multi-purpose move. It just defends the bishop. It's an overprotection move. It's too cautious here, and it also loses sight of a2, so it's a bit short-sighted, I think. And then if you do land in a tough position, or it's heading that way, ideally try to steer away from, you know, strategic domination and a slow death before it gets to that point. In this case, though, it was difficult. It looks like white needed to play a move like b4, or some of these lines where white was daring me to take a2. Maybe even avoiding putting the pawn on a3 is best here. Like I was saying, rook back to a1 from a human standpoint. Okay, so thanks to zopenco61 for the game. Hope you guys enjoyed this. Analyze your games. Enjoy your weekend as well. And I'll be back again soon with another video. Bye, guys.